Hi, I'm Zoe from Paranormal Extraction. And don't forget, you can find me on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram. Today, I am so delighted, and you guys are going to love this, because I have Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Randle with Levelland. Okay, we might kind of brush off.
Levelland.
Oh, Levelland. Oh my God. Sorry, Kevin. We've had a little bit of computer problems today, but that's going to be okay. So if anything happens, we'll just move on from there. But I wanted to let you know that he has over 100 books, okay? I'm not going to get into his bio, but I really, really am excited to have this opportunity to speak to Kevin today. And so we're going to go over and we're going to start. Can you believe I said the wrong thing again? Kevin, I am so delighted today and honored. And I want to say I thank you for your service. I know that you're retired right now, and we're going to talk about Levelland. Now, I know you do extensive amount of research on each subject that you've talked about. And so why don't you explain a little bit about Levelland, because that's your latest book that's out, and you can find it on Amazon, right? I looked it up.
It is on Amazon, yes.
Okay. So I know that this event happened in Levelland and in 1957. So why don't you tell us the truth, because you're the one that goes out and finds out about the truth on what happens on these different experiences that you've had.
I believe that Levelland is maybe the second most important UFO case, following Roswell, of course. And the reason I say that is because it is multiple witness, many witnesses. There's interaction with the environment, meaning that the close approach of the UFO stalled cars. There's evidence that the Air Force was involved in the earliest investigation of this, and that they finally concluded it was ball lightning, which is a completely bogus explanation for it. So what happened is a fellow named Pedro Saucedo was driving toward Levelland when a bright blue glowing object came down close to his pickup truck, stalled the engine, dimmed the headlights, and filled the radio with static. He was so frightened by the event, he dived out of the truck and rolled underneath it. His passenger sat paralyzed in the front seat. And when I say paralyzed, I mean he was just shocked. There was nothing that the UFO did to paralyze him. After a few minutes, the craft turned a bright red, bright orange, and took off. And once it did, then Saucedo was able to get his car started, his truck started again. He called the Levelland police, or the Levelland sheriff, Weir Clem, and I've always hated that name. I wished he had a name like Jack Armstrong, or something good.
Yeah.
But he called the sheriff. The sheriff's deputies didn't believe the story, thought he was drunk. But within the next couple of hours, they received numbers of phone calls from people around the area, not just in Levelland, but all around the town. Witnesses at least 13 separate locations that I could verify, and probably a lot more, said the same thing had happened to them. This glowing object had come close to their car or their truck, stalled the engine, filled the radio with static. They couldn't restart the car while the object was close by, but once it was gone, they were able to restart their car, and they would call the sheriff's office or the Levelland police. The sheriff eventually decided that he needed to go out and look. He went out with one of his deputies in his car. Following him was a car from the state police. I think it's the Texas Department of Public Safety. I know it is now. I'm not sure if it was in 1957.
Right.
Behind them was a car from the Air Force with Air Force officers in it. Now, according to the Air Force report, all that the sheriff saw was a streak of red light in the distance. Prior to the Air Force investigation, the sheriff had told reporters that he had seen a glowing red object. He'd seen an actual oval-shaped, or what he called a football-shaped object, so he got much closer. A fellow named Don Burlinson from Roswell, New Mexico, interview. Roswell's not all that far, I should say. Roswell's not all that far from Levelland. It's about 2 or 3 hours by car. Burlinson went over there and talked to the sheriff's widow, around the turn of the century, had talked to the sheriff's daughter. And from them, he learned that the sheriff had gotten much, much closer and that his car had probably been stalled. Williamson interviewed the mechanic who worked on the sheriff's cars in 1957, and he said that the sheriff brought the car in the next day. Well, the only reason the sheriff would have brought the car in the next day to have it examined by the mechanic is if it stalled, which means if it stalled, then the car with the Texas State Police in it stalled, and the car with the Air Force officers in it stalled. We have no record of the Air Force officers beyond them being with the sheriff that night, being interviewed. There's no record of them in the Project Blue Book file, so their experiences are completely separate from the Levelland case file, wherever the Air Force officers' cases went. Within a number of hours after the object disappeared from Levelland, it appeared in, I say it appeared, another sighting took place at White Sands Missile Range, which would be, I would say, 4 hours from Levelland. MPs working there saw an object come down close to the ground. It didn't stall their Jeep, but it was silhouetted against the background of the mountains, and it took off and they reported it. The Air Force investigated and said, well, they were caught up in the hysteria of the time about the UFO sightings, and that was what precipitated that. And what they saw was the moon. The problem with that is, A, they couldn't have been caught up in the hysteria of the time because they weren't living in our world where if that had happened to you, you would have put it on Instagram and posted video, and
right.
Social media would have been afire with this sort of thing, with everybody and his brother going out and looking for it. So they couldn't be caught up in the hysteria. 12 or 14 hours later, another MP unit patrolling the same area had a similar experience, and the Air Force wrote it off as Venus. So clearly they didn't. Within 2 or 3 days, a fellow named Stokes, and for some reason I cannot remember his first name at the moment. Oh, James Stokes, I remembered it.
That's kind of like me forgetting your name of your book, right?
Yeah, it's called Levelland.
Yeah, there you go. Now, weren't these objects blue, like a blue circle or blue kind of oblong light that came down?
The first sighting with Pedro Saucedo, it was a glowing blue object that came down.
Okay.
It turned bright red or orange, and then it took off. And from that point on, the object was described as red, a bright red or bright orange.
Okay.
But the original sighting by Pedro Saucedo, he talked about it being a blue object coming down. Anyway, Stokes was driving between Alamogordo and El Paso in a small town in New Mexico called Oro Grande, which is not all that far from Alamogordo, which is not all that far from Roswell, and now we're back to Levelland. He noticed his car radio was fading out. Eventually, his car stalled, and as he pulled over the side of the road, he saw 6 or 7 cars pulled out, or stalled as well. And the people were outside looking at this egg-shaped object that was buzzing the highway. When it disappeared, they all could get their cars started again. And he, of course, went back to Alamogordo, reported to his boss. He worked at the Holloman Air Force Base, so he reported to his boss, a major, that he'd just seen this object and could he talk about it. And the major said, did it happen during duty hours? And he said no. And he said, did it happen on our confines of our base? And he said no. He said, well, I don't care if you talk about it or not then. So Stokes reported it to the Lorenzens, Carl and Jim Lorenzen, who were the leaders of APRO, which was based at that time in Alamogordo. And when Stokes talked to them, he had a sort of a partial sunburn on part of his face and one of his arms, not unlike Richard Dreyfuss in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but it wasn't nearly as dramatic as Dreyfuss's.
Wow.
By the time the Air Force showed up, the redness to his skin had faded. The Air Force then spent a great deal of time trying to smear Stokes' reputation. Stokes said, well, I'm an engineer out at the base. And they said, no, you're not an engineer, you're a technician and all this stuff. And,
right.
And coincidentally, the people at Holloman Air Force Base, his bosses, said, no, he's an engineer. He's working as an engineer. And he was promoted slightly after that into an even higher grade as an engineer. So we had the Air Force on one hand trying to smear him, and the Air Force on the other hand saying, no, he's a good guy. He's telling the truth. He's got 22 years in the Navy. He's been working with us as an engineer. So that kind of encapsulates the whole Levelland thing, dragging in Stokes from 2 days later, and of course the MPs at White Sands And then there's many other sightings around the Levelland area that we haven't even touched on.
Wow, okay. So going from the Levelland experience, okay, now did you actually interview any of these people?
Oh, yes.
Was it you? Okay, it was you, right? Okay.
I interviewed, for example, one of the MPs, Glenn Toy. He was 20 or 21 years old in 1957. I talked to him 10 years ago about this. He actually sent me a picture of the 4 MPs who were interviewed by the radio station. So I had the pictures in the book as well. But yeah, I talked to them. I talked to a number of the other people who were either directly or indirectly involved in the case. Went through the Project Blue Book file, which is now available to practically everybody who wants to look for it.
Right. So was it in the Project Blue Book file, or did they actually said it was that it wasn't real, right?
Well, they said it was ball lightning, misinterpretation of ball lightning. Not understand what ball lightning is, but ball lightning is something that is very, very small, 18 inches to 24 inches in diameter, a foot and a half to 2 feet in diameter, and very short life, lasts a matter of seconds. And there's still an argument whether ball lightning as such really exists. Yes. But that's the official explanation. But as I was saying, there is a case file on it. The fellow who interviewed him was Norman Barth. He was a mid-level NCO, mid-level sergeant. Came down from Ent Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. I don't know why, because Reese Air Force Base is in Lubbock, which is 15 minutes away from Levelland. And the officers who were with the sheriff that night were from Reese Air Force Base. So I don't know why that happened that way. But in the Air Force file, they only talked to 6 witnesses. I can give you the names of literally dozens of witnesses who were involved. There's all sorts of newspaper articles where the newspapers had talked to the people. So we have not only the official file from the Air Force about what happened, but I also have all these newspaper clippings from the time where the reporters were talking to it. I also talked to Don Burlinson, who interviewed the sheriff's family, and other people who were marginally connected to the case. But we've looked at the documentation, we've looked at the people, we've gathered as much evidence as we could about this specific case, and then I expanded from there, because this is not the only case where we have this kind of interference. These electromagnetic effects, as they're called, are rare. They're not reported with every UFO sighting, but there are a number of them. Mark Rodiger, who is the scientific director at the Jalon Hynek Center for UFO Studies, did a monograph in 1985, 1986, where he listed some 450 cases of vehicle interference by UFOs, starting in 1909.
Wow.
With a guy riding his motorcycle in a glowing orb in a nearby field caused his headlight to go out.
Wow.
And up through animal reactions to UFOs, nothing up through, I think, 2019, 2020, I think is the latest case. But there was a big wave of these things in Europe in 1954 where people not only had their cars stalled, but, and that was why I clarified the passenger with Pedro Saucedo being paralyzed, because in the French cases in 1954, a lot of people, when they got close, they were paralyzed. They couldn't move. They couldn't shout until the object went away. Sometimes they were hit by a beam of light that did that to them. So that's another kind of subset of this whole thing of these interactions with the environment. And I think the reason the people were paralyzed was not because of the UFO or the occupants wanting to harm people, but they were trying to keep them away from the craft and stop them from approaching too close.
Okay, and none of them got taken up or abducted by any type of craft or anything like that. Basically,
in these cases in Levelland, in the cases I've talked about here, no, there was no abductions involved. It was just close approach of the UFO to the ground, the interaction with the environment. That's what was going on there. There's a very few cases, France specifically, where occupants are seen. So they describe creatures from inside the craft, but they're not being dragged into the craft.
Okay, so they actually did see something. Now, did that come out of the red object then? How did they see it?
No. Most of the cases where occupants were seen were from France in 1954.
Okay.
It's a big long listing in the book of those cases. With the Levelland sighting, nobody saw any creatures. It was just the object close to the ground,
Right.
close to their vehicle.
Okay. All right. So I know that that's a little bit about level, your book that's out, Levelland, right? Let's get
Yes.
the right name again.
It's not Littleton.
I know, because we kind of had some problems there in the beginning, but I wanted to I know you have 2 other books out, and I wanted to skip on a little bit to Roswell, because we did discuss that, and that happened after this event, and it's with all of your research that you've done, you kind of blew my mind on that. And what is the name of that Roswell book that you have out?
Well, the latest book is called Understanding Roswell, and
Right.
of course, like Levelland, it's available right now this minute on Amazon for those. And what I did was look at it, and I've done sort of the same thing in a book called Roswell in the 21st Century. Look at it as a cold case, going back over the notes and the interviews and everything that Don Schmidt and I had collected since we began the investigation in 1989 of the Roswell case. But this is the one I think that set the tone. The Roswell case is the one that set the tone for the way the government has treated UFOs from the very beginning. This happened within 8 days of
Right.
of Kenneth Arnold sighting in June of 1947. And I think what happened was, you look at the newspapers, you look at the documentation from that era, and you can see that they don't know what's going on. There's a lot of speculation in the newspapers about what it could be, where it's from, where UFOs are from, flying saucers are from, collections of other people's experience. And you get up to July 8th, and that's when the people in Roswell announced they had captured a flying saucer.
Right.
And so we have the crash. And the next day, we've had an awful lot of interest in the newspapers, and a lot of stories in the newspapers from Kenneth Arnold up to July 8th. And then on July 9th, there's an article that says the Army and Navy moved today to stop stories of flying saucers whizzing through our atmosphere. So the question becomes, why did they suddenly care on July 9th when they hadn't cared before?
Right.
And that's because they picked one up. They knew they had a better idea of what was going on, and they realized the necessity for keeping that information under wraps till they understood it.
Okay, so do you think that it actually did crash?
Yes.
Okay, you did. And that there was a government cover-up?
Well, obviously. And in fact, the government admitted there was a cover-up. But they were saying, well, what was found in Roswell was the remains of a top secret balloon project known as Mogul. But the problem is what was going on in New Mexico in July of 1947 was not classified and was not top secret. The ultimate purpose, which was to spy on the Soviet Union, was classified. The experimentation going on in New Mexico was not classified. In fact, there was an article in the newspaper on July 10th, in newspapers around the country, as a matter of fact, not just the Alamogordo News, but around the country, explaining this project going on in Alamogordo to put a balloon in the upper regions of the atmosphere to try to detect Soviet detonations of atomic weapons is what the whole purpose was. But so in 1995 they said, well, we had this top secret project, so of course we covered up what was really found in New Mexico with this idea it was a weather balloon. And what was funny is I said, well, in 1947 we said it was a weather balloon, and here in 1995 we discovered what it was. It was a weather balloon. Just a fancier weather balloon.
Now, didn't you go through some documents that they have now through the government to kind of learn more about, through your research about that are available now for you to come up with your conclusions and your research?
There's very, very few documents available on Roswell. We can look at the Air Force report that was published in 1995 about it. It's a document 2.5 inches thick. Most of it's filled up with information about the balloon projects in New Mexico. They conducted a few interviews with some of the witnesses, but not all of the witnesses. They concentrated on the people who were working on Mogul at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and one guy who was involved in launching of balloons in Alamogordo, whom I talked to a half a dozen times before the Air Force ever talked to him. And they talked to Sheridan Cabot, who was assigned to the Roswell base in 1947 and went out with Jesse Marcel to retrieve the debris. And of course, Don Schmidt and I had talked to him a number of times, both in person and on the telephone. We visited him when he was wintering in Sierra Vista, Arizona, which is right outside of Fort Huachuca. And I mention that because Fort Huachuca is where the Army has its big intelligence schools and whatnot.
Okay.
And then he lived in Sequim, Washington, so we visited him once in Sequim, Washington, to talk about this sort of thing.
Wow.
But the documentation is limited. We have an FBI telex that went out in July 8, 1947, and we have what's called the Rainy Memo, which is a photograph taken by a fellow named J. Bond Johnson. He was a reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and he was sent to Ramey's office to get the story of what they had found, because it had been sent from Roswell to Fort Worth, apparently. And Ramey is crouched there by this balloon wreckage. It's obviously a balloon wreckage. It's not the stuff that Jesse Marcel brought from Roswell, according to Jesse Marcel and Thomas DuBose, who were both in the room. And I haven't talked to both of them, but Don talked to DuBose, and we had videotape and audio tape of Jesse Marcel's interviews as well.
Okay.
But Baby's holding this piece of paper in his hand, and one of the things that's being done is an attempt to read that document. You can, if you get it like an 8x10 blow up of it, use a magnifying glass, you can actually pick out some words, and it's universally accepted there's some words. But the camera is just a little bit too far away. The way Raymond's holding the paper is just angled a little bit too much. It's sort of clutched in his hand and kind of wrinkled. So you can't read everything. There's various interpretations of it. And there's been, I don't know how many different scans using the advancements in our technology. We did one just a couple of years ago at the using the original negative, and it was scanned down almost to the molecular level, so that we were trying to resolve the image, and we just couldn't get to that point. I don't think our technology is ever going to evolve to a point where we can actually read it using this kind of a technology. And the suggestion was it's going to have to be done now by artificial intelligence that can just sort of calculate these literally hundreds, thousands of calculations in a split second to kind of divine what is on that paper. We just haven't been able to get it resolved yet. We've got some interesting readings on it, but there's nothing that's universally accepted.
Okay, so do you think that since they recovered that craft, first I have two questions. Do you think that they did find aliens? And second of all, do you think that they're using the technology that they found inside of this UFO currently?
Yes and no.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's start with one.
Let me explain.
Okay.
I know as his interview, the last thing you want anybody to say, you ask a question, they say, well, yes.
Well, okay.
Let me expand. Expand.
Yeah, I'm going to.
Based on the evidence that Don Schmidt and I and Tom Carey have uncovered from eyewitness testimony, people who were there, people who can be trusted, people whose testimony hasn't blown up in our faces, suggest that yes, bodies were recovered. They were taken first to the base in Roswell, of course, it's the Roswell Army Airfield, later Walker Air Force Base, and then they were flown to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, of course, in July of 1947. And so yes, they were recovered. General Arthur Exxon, who both Don and I guess Tom have all talked to, mentioned that one of the bodies had been sent to Denver, Colorado in 1947. At that time, it became Lowry Air Force Base. I'm not sure what the name was in 1947, but that base, Lowry Air Force Base, outside of Denver, near Aurora, Colorado, had the Army's mortuary service at the time. So one of the bodies was sent there so they could discover the best ways to preserve the bodies, because getting samples of alien tissue isn't something that happens every day, so you're going to want to preserve it as best you can. As for the wreckage, General Exxon is the one that told us it went to Lowry Air Force Base, and General Exxon was in Wright Field in 1947, so he was there to observe what was going on. And in the various books that I've done on Roswell, we talk about Exxon's testimony, and it's been consistent throughout the years. I mean, the only controversy that came up, and it's kind of funny, is we were accused, and I say we, Don Schmidt and I, specifically me, were accused of misquoting Exxon in our first book, UFO Crash at Roswell.
Wow! Again,
that was by Stan Friedman. He said, well, I called General Exxon. He said, you misquoted him. And I said, I got the quotes on tape. I didn't misquote him, but I sent a copy of the book to General Exxon. I sent a copy of the tape to General Exxon, and I said, where did we misquote you?
Wow.
And he sent me a handwritten letter back saying, well, the quotes are accurate. That ended that conversation, but people still sling that allegation. And it just came up a few months ago, and I was able to say, well, here's the letter from General Exxon where he says the quotes are accurate, so you can now go away. The one thing he did clarify, he said, but I want you to understand, I think you gave more importance to my testimony than it deserved, because I was just telling you what I knew from people who had been there, that I talked to, my friends who were telling me what was going on, and his limited firsthand involvement. But here's a general officer from the United States Air Force saying, yeah, Roswell is extraterrestrial.
Okay, so why, Kevin, why hasn't this come out? I mean, everything that you're talking about, why hasn't, this is the truth, this is what you've done, this is what you've researched. Why is it that they have all of this other kind of bull crap going on about Roswell?
Well, it's not just Roswell, it's about the whole UFO field. If you go back to read Ed Ruppel's book from 1956, he was one time the chief of Project Blue Book in the early 1950s.
Yeah, okay.
And he said in the summer of 1947, the Pentagon was in a panic. They didn't know what was going on. They've got these sightings. They think of them as credible sightings. They're pilots, Air Force pilots, Army Air Forces pilots, are seeing these UFOs and reporting them. And they're believing what these guys are saying to them, and they're in a panic. They don't know what's going on. Is it a Soviet development? Is it some other competitor in the world spying on our work in New Mexico? Because the first atomic bomb was detonated at the Trinity site, not all that far from Roswell. Los Alamos is in northern New Mexico. The only atomic strike force in the world is based at Roswell. So if you're an alien race, these might be some of the places you want to go to see what kind of threat we pose to them.
This is amazing.
They just didn't understand what was going on. And people say, well, okay, that makes sense for 1947. Why does it persist till today? Because we're all now kind of used to the idea of alien visitations. We've got science fiction programs talking about that.
Yeah, we do.
We've sent probes to every planet well, I'm not going to say every planet in the solar system, because apparently we don't know how many planets are in the solar system now. There used to be 9, and now there's 8, but maybe there's 9 or 10, so we're not really sure. But we've launched a probe that's now out into deep space and that sort of thing. So why is it persisting today? And I did a book called UFOs in the Deep State. And I think the answer is the people in the government, and we have to remember that the bureaucrats, the high-ranking bureaucrats, not the president, not the vice president, not the Congress, and not the secretaries of whatever department, they serve at the pleasure of the president. And when the president is out of office, whether he's not reelected or his terms have ended, those people often transition into other arenas. But there's bureaucrats, high-level bureaucrats, that remain in position from administration to administration to administration. And you see in the Biden administration today, names that appeared first in the Clinton administration. So I think these people are protecting their position and their power. It all comes down to power. And if they admit that flying saucers are real, there's an alien presence here that we can do nothing about, and has a technology that's far superior to ours, their power is weakened. And so their best move is to continue to deny, continue to suppress, continue to deflect as much as they can. I talked to a guy named Daniel Sheehan, who is an attorney, and he's active in the UFO field. And he was given an assignment by Jimmy Carter, President Carter, because Carter was interested in UFOs. He wanted to find out what's going on.
Yeah, he actually saw one when he was on the deck at a party.
Well, Yes, I think we pretty well know what he saw. It wasn't an alien spacecraft, but at the time he was president, everybody thought that he'd seen a real alien spacecraft. But that's
okay.
there. The point is, he was very interested in it, and he wanted to find out what was going
Yes.
on. So he called in his director of Central Intelligence, George H.W. Bush. And he says, Director Bush, I want you to tell me everything you can about UFOs. And Bush says, well, once you were inaugurated, because this was when Carter was the president-elect, once you're inaugurated, I would like to stay on as Director of Central Intelligence. And Carter says, I'm bringing in my own guy. And Bush's response, well, Mr. President, I can't tell you anything about it because you don't have the need to know and you're not president yet. So here's a guy who's about to become president, the Director of Central Intelligence, is saying, I'm not going to show it to you. And so I think what happened from that point, I think what we saw happen today is when a president shows up, and now he's the president and he can do these sorts of things, he goes to the Director of Central Intelligence or his Director of National Intelligence or the Director of the FBI, and he says, I'd like to know everything you can about UFOs. And those people realize they're serving at the pleasure of the president, say, it's a very complex question, and there's information in various organizations around. Let me gather that information and make a comprehensive report for you. And somehow that comprehensive report never gets made. So they deflected the president. And we had an example of this recently where Congress directed the Director of National Intelligence to put together a report on the Navy TikTok sightings and the sightings by the naval personnel. And you have 180 days to prepare it. And we want a briefing. We saw the briefing in June of last year, and it was a grade C minus high school report. It was like 9 pages, and well, we looked at 144 reports, and we don't know what that means, by the way. Was it 144 separate cases, or it was like 15 cases and several reports from various individuals about it? I mean, exactly what does that mean? And it basically said, we don't know what's going on, and they were directed to come up with another report within 90 days, which would have been October 25th of last year. And of course, you've heard nothing about that either. So they deflected it for now better than a year, more than a year.
That's
we
right.
still have no answers. And now Congress has created an office to investigate UFOs. Didn't we do that 75 years ago? Didn't General Twining, who was the commanding officer of the Air Material Command based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, write a letter in September of 1947, says that this phenomenon, flying saucers, is something real, it's not illusionary, it's not fictitious, and we're going to create an office to investigate it with a high priority and a classification. They did this whole thing back in 1947. Here we are in 2022, and we're right back there. We're going to create an office and investigate this. And fortunately, we're going to be talking to military personnel, so a lot of this information is going to be classified.
What a joke. Now, okay, so now they're releasing one, from the military about the Tic Tac. Okay, so why is the Tic Tac so big? I mean, are they preparing us to maybe release any of this information? Or, are they preparing the public? Or, because obviously there's way more occurrences that have happened before that. I mean, what about, was it the power plant or the nuclear power plant that was supposedly turned off when they were using getting ready to use one of their nuclear weapons or something like that? Isn't that also something that's been hidden or it's been talked about? I mean, why are they doing this? I mean, and isn't this in your book about the deep state?
We talk about a lot of that in the deep state. In 1967, there was the Condon Committee, which was the University of Colorado study of UFOs. They were commissioned by the Air Force to take a look at it. They were determined 3 things. Is there a threat to national security? Has the Air Force investigation been good? And what should we do? Of course, it was all laid out prior to that. What you find out is there is no threat for national security. The Air Force has done a good job, and we have no reason to continue investigation. That was all laid out before the investigation started. Point simply is, and you kind of alluded to it here, in, I believe, March of 1967, I think it's March of 1967, there was a series of sightings in Belt, Montana. Near Belt, Montana is Malmstrom Air Force Base. It was one of the bases that had these huge fields of ballistic missiles. And these are scattered all over.
That's right. They were missiles. Okay.
Scattered all over Montana, and they're 90, 100 miles away from the base. So if the base is hit or one of the missile fields is hit by an atomic weapon, you don't take out everything. Supposedly, you cannot shut down these things from outside. You cannot be done. And yet, in March of 1967, a whole flight of missiles, 10 missiles in one flight, were shut down from outside the base, and they don't know what caused it.
Right.
When the Condon Committee was investigating, their investigator was at Belt, Montana to look at the UFO sightings there, and he mentioned the missile shutdown and the UFO officer at the base, Chase Lewis, I believe. It's either Chase Lewis or Lewis Chase. Can't remember which name his name was.
I don't know how you remember all these names.
I have a list.
Amazing.
But the UFO officer said to the county committee investigator, he said, I can't tell you that. That's a matter of national security. So now we have a UFO sighting associated with the missile shutdown and a matter of national security, and yet the Condon Committee concludes there is no threat to national security. Well, the problem is, if it gets out that the missiles can be shut down from the outside, even though the Soviets didn't know how to do it, they know it can be done, they begin to look for a way of doing it. So it is a matter of national security. So when that happened, the Condon Committee just said, well, there's no evidence that national security has ever been threatened. A fellow, Robert Hastings, did a book called UFOs and Nukes. And what it was, he had connections into an awful lot of the Air Force personnel. I think his father was in the Air Force, and Robert, as a teenager, was talking to these guys and learned this stuff. So he began to gather these stories by missileers, guys down in the silos, of the UFOs approaching the bases, and bases all along the upper tier around just south of the border from Canada, the northern United States, talking to people about there. There was a guy from Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the reason I remember that is because I was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So, and my grandparents lived like 2 blocks from Warren Air Force Base. So he talked to these people and found there were many other instances where flights were disabled in some fashion, or UFOs were seen over the missile silos and that sort of thing, or interacting with that. Bent waters became important for one of the aspects is the UFO being close to the weapons storage facilities, where the atomic weapons would have been stored. So there's been a great interest apparently by UFOs of this sort of thing, and the book to look at for that would be Robert Hastings' book on it.
Okay, and what's the name of his book again?
UFOs and Nukes, or Nukes and UFOs.
Okay, okay.
But just look for Robert Hastings, and it should come up on Amazon. And or type his name into my blog, and the stuff will come up, and it'll link to those sorts of things.
Okay, and where do you find your blog again?
It's kevinrandle.blogspot.com.
Rawspot?
It's www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com.
Oh, Blogspot. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Now,
sometimes I slur my words.
Okay, so we are talking about that there's still a cover-up, obviously, and that's what I was asking you about. Why is it that they're only showing us a Tic Tac? That was one of my questions. And why are they only showing us that? I mean, that's the only thing the public is seeing.
I think the reason that we saw those cockpit videos taken by the Navy, was that they hadn't been classified. From what I understand, and this is from John Greenwald, that they had not classified them, and so when it may have been Lou Alexandra who passed it on to the news media. I think that's the way it went. But he didn't violate any regulations. So now we've got the Tic Tacs, but the problem is they're not definitive evidence. And so we learn a little bit about that, but there's supposedly lots of other sightings that we don't know about. But the real problem here is now what we learn is that with the creation of this office to investigate UFOs in space environment, a lot of that information is going to be born classified, which means that when the events take place, it's immediately classified. And if there's military pilots involved or military personnel involved, it's going to be classified. And they can ignore an awful lot of the civilian sightings, as they did during Project Blue Book.
Yeah, that goes way back. And then out of all of the things that he actually found, then they took most of them out. And then there was only so many left of his, right?
Well, Blue Book looked at some 13,000 UFO reports in its 22-year history.
Right, but then
Some of them were solved. I mean, some of them, the Air Force legitimately solved some of the cases. You look at the information and you look at the timing and say, oh, this is obvious. In fact, I just did a report on Coast to Coast about a photograph taken over Memphis, Tennessee, just not that long ago. And I posted it to the blog. And I said, it's interesting here. And within 2 or 3 days, we learned exactly what it was. It was a fuel dump by a SpaceX rocket. And there was another picture that looked an awful lot like it that identified this is a SpaceX rocket making a fuel dump. And it looked exactly like what was taken over Memphis, Tennessee. So we solved that case. We know what it is. It's not an alien spacecraft. It's a terrestrially based spacecraft, but it's not of alien manufacture. And so when the Air Force solved cases, some of them they legitimately solved. Some of them they worked very hard to smear the witnesses so you wouldn't believe what they had to say. And some of them they just threw ridiculous explanations at it, like the ball lightning from Levelland.
Right.
Clearly, ball lightning wouldn't be spinning around Levelland, Texas for 2.5, 3 hours. It wouldn't be described as a huge glowing egg-shaped object that stalls car engines, because we have no reports of ball lightning stalling a car engine at all.
Right.
And that's the answer that persists till today.
Now, didn't you work with the guy on Project Blue Book? Didn't you know him?
I've talked to a couple of people who were with Project Blue Book, but I myself never worked on. That's something else I've been accused of, to kind of belittle my work by people who don't like some of the things I say about UFOs cases being solved. Say, well, he worked on Project Blue Book. Well, Project Blue Book was closed officially in I think July of 1969. It was announced it was going to be closed earlier than that. In July of 1969, I was in Vietnam. I had nothing to do with Project Blue Book. Prior to that, I was in high school. So I was not working on Project Blue Book. I had no association with Project Blue Book in that respect. I have talked to people who worked with Project Blue Book. I've talked to some of the officers who were the local base representatives, the UFO representatives. And I talked to the last guy who was in charge of Blue Book, but only by technicality. He was the senior officer left as they were closing out the office. So a guy named Carmen Morano, who is a very, very nice guy to talk to. We should applaud him, because a lot of the Blue Book stuff was supposed to be thrown away.
Right.
And he thought, we should preserve this stuff. So he did. And he carried it because it was going to be thrown away, so he just kept it. And then in a bizarre situation, the guy bought some lumber at a garage sale. And with this lumber, as he's carrying out, he found a box of documents that were Project Blue Book.
Wow, that's incredible.
Well, a guy named Rob Mercer, who lives in Ohio, is a UFO investigator, UFO researcher, would look at Craigslist periodically to see if there was anything UFO related for sale on there. And this guy had put the box up for sale on Craigslist. And so Mercer bought the box.
Okay, unbelievable.
But it gets even more unbelievable. This is just a single box. And so Mercer tracked down the people who owned the house and found out who had left the box behind. And it was this guy, Carmen Morano. And Mercer tracked him down in Alabama. And Morano says to him, I've got some other boxes. If you want them, you can have them. So he sent him 4 or 5 additional boxes. And one of the things that's in there, which is almost priceless to UFO researchers, when the Air Force released Project Blue Book files into the public arena, before they did that, they went through and they redacted all the names. So they've got this big index and you look at it, and you've got the date of the sighting and the location of the sighting and the conclusion, and in the center where the witnesses are, it's mostly blacked out. Now, Bob Quinn and I had actually got to see the indexes before that happened. We saw them at Maxwell Air Force Base, and the first thing we did was we went through the whole index, and we wrote down the names of everybody who was involved in the unidentified sighting. And we thought, well, we've got a unique document here, but it turns out Don Berliner did the same thing when they got to the National Archives before the Air Force. So that was out. But Mercer's got the index pristine, everything of it. All 12,000 cases with all the names plugged in.
Unbelievable. Okay, so they got blacked out by the time it got to the government, is what you're saying?
No, the government blacked it out before they released it to the National Archives for public scrutiny. The idea being that when the witnesses gave the testimony or gave the reports to the Air Force, they were promised their names wouldn't be made public. So the Air Force, I think, felt it an obligation to remove the names, even though we're going back to the 1940s, and a lot of the people, it wouldn't make any difference. The one thing that kind of struck me was there was a case from 1952, and there was 3 or 4 Boy Scouts involved in it. And of course, they blacked out the Boy Scouts' names. I'm thinking, well, these guys were 12, 13 years old. We don't want to bother them. And then it dawns on me, these guys are older than I am.
Yeah.
What difference would it make? And then the other thing they didn't do well, they didn't do a good job of blacking out, because the Kenneth Arnold case, for example, the Arnold sighting that sparked this whole thing, they went through and they tried to black out Arnold's name wherever it appeared, and there was a telephone conversation with Arnold's initials and the officer who was interviewing him, and they blacked out the KA for Kenneth Arnold through all the interview, but on one of the pages in like a grease pencil, a half an inch high, it says Arnold sighting. So we knew it was the Arnold sighting, but you look at the newspaper clippings that are attached to some of the files, and they didn't black the names out in the newspaper files. So we could put them back in, and it's a rare case that I would look at in the Project Blue Book files where I could not find some hint as to who the witness was, so I could put the names back in. But the point is, Rob Mercer has a file with everybody's name in it, so there's no guesswork.
That's unbelievable. Okay, so lastly, I just have this, everybody thinks, I just want to ask you about the Roswell book that you have. Are you talking, what did they do with those aliens? I know you said they flew them over to the Air Force Base, but do you have any idea what they did with these bodies?
We have gotten a little bit of information on that, and I'm not sure how solid it is. I think what General Exxon told us, one of the bodies went to Lowry Air Force Base in Denver. I think that's solid information. What happened to it after that, I don't know. The other bodies were at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We heard at one point, I think, that they went to a big medical facility at MacDill Air Force Base. But I'm not sure that information is solid. But that was the things we've got. We've gotten hints, but we don't know. We really don't know where they went. Once they left the Roswell area and got to Wright Field, we really don't know where they went.
Wow. So with all your research, you never found out about that. That's amazing.
Well, I think the problem there is when you got to the point of the bodies, the number of people involved was much smaller than that involved with cleaning up the debris and that sort of thing. The number of people who had good information about it was much smaller. And then I think once it left Roswell, that number shrunk even more, so that you had fewer and fewer people involved. So it was much easier to keep that a secret than the idea of the crash. The crash had been already in the newspapers, but it didn't say anything about bodies. And so they could divert that, and they just kept that information to themselves. So I think the reason we haven't been able to crack that, even though we've heard rumors about that, is that the number was so small, but the people who were involved in that end of the research were the ones who could be most trusted with that information, wouldn't be leaking it into the public. And now we're to the point where I'm not sure exactly how many people know this. I think what's happened is as we've lost an awful lot of the witnesses to what the events in Roswell and some of the people who were involved in the early exploitation of the materials. And I think that as our technology expands, that technology is applied to the recovered materials to see if we can learn anything from it. But I don't think we've been able to crack the codes. I think it's the technology is too far advanced, or there's something we do not know. And the best example I can think of, and I hope everybody understands this, if you took a VCR, a video cassette recorder, a videotape, which is basically a black ribbon, and a television and a power pack back to Merlin the Magician, and you showed him this black ribbon, if you know the secret, you can get colored pictures and sound, and you say, okay, crack the code. And to do that, he's got to know about two things that are invisible: electricity and magnetism. He has no way of solving that problem because he just does not have those two key pieces of information. And I suspect when we're dealing with a technology that is that far superior to ours, that allows for interstellar flight, that we do not have the technology to understand it. But as our technology increases, we apply it to it to see what we might be able to learn.
Okay, so you're talking about the actual UFO, that they have not been able to figure this out because they've been saying that they're using part of that information for AI now, for artificial intelligence. What you're saying is that this is too far advanced, that we still don't have anything that we're using from these recovered UFOs.
I would say I know of nothing, which is not to say they haven't made progress. It's just that I don't know what that progress might be, and I don't know of anybody in the UFO field who really knows. There's speculation about some of this stuff, and I think we have to take a look at that speculation and see if it makes sense to us. And so far, I have seen nothing to suggest that they've been able to crack the codes of what they recovered from the craft. Of course, if you're looking at the alien bodies, all that will tell you is something about their environment, where they live, but it doesn't really apply to us, or how they lived, or anything about them. We could look at their body structure, the forensics of their body structure, and all of that sort of thing. But that doesn't tell us where they're from. It might give a hint about the gravity on their planet. It might give a hint about the atmosphere they breathe. It might give a hint about the brightness of their star. But it really doesn't tell us anything about where they came from. You know, we'll say, well, it was a very bright star, and this, that, and the other thing, and we can say, well, it might be a planet around this star or this star, but we really don't know. But when you're dealing with the debris, with the remains of the spacecraft, now we got something we can look at and we can experiment with. There was a guy named Boldra who knew Pappy Henderson being at the Roswell Army Airfield, who supposedly had a piece of the debris. And Boldra and a couple of his friends, Krumschroeder, I think it was, looked at the debris and said that when you energized it, applied electricity to it, it would glow with a blue light. And so,
wow, I haven't heard that.
It's in UFO Crash at Roswell. We talk about Boulder's work on that. He was a dentist, I believe.
A dentist?
Well, but it doesn't matter. He's got technical training.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I know.
And I mean, it doesn't take a scientist to connect two wires from a battery to something to see what happens.
Yeah.
And when you did that, the thing would glow with kind of a very soft blue light. It kind of energized the whole panel. So if you had a wall of this sort of stuff, you know, it would energize the whole room that way. That's one of the things, but I don't know. Stan Friedman and I visited Patty Henderson's wife, Sappho Henderson. She lived in California. Patty Henderson had died years earlier. And everything was stored in two sheds out behind the house. And supposedly the piece of debris that Pappy Henderson had was now in one of those storage sheds, but we never got an opportunity to look through that stuff. And she had said that they had kind of looked for that piece of debris since that time, and they had not been able to find it. And we've heard a number of stories about pieces of debris escaping the public arena.
They have them. You know, they have them. I mean, I'm just giving example, Ancient Aliens, and Hal, was on there talking about a piece that she actually had.
But the problem with that, there was nothing in this debris that has escaped into the public arena, allegedly escaped into the public arena, that pinpoints it as being of extraterrestrial manufacture. In 1997, one of the big announcements at the Roswell Festival was they had a piece of debris, and they were going to show it to us. They had a scientist there to talk about it, and they were going to provide us with a chain of custody, how it got from the debris field to the stage in Roswell. What happened was the scientist who showed up, he was supposedly working at one of the California universities.
Yes, that did happen.
But he was not a professor. He was a research fellow there, I think, which doesn't belittle his credentials. It just, he was presented as something that he wasn't, and I don't think that was his fault. He did not take questions. They provided information about the isotopic ratio of the materials, and said this is not found naturally on Earth.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the other says, yeah, but we've made it. I mean, they have been able to change the isotopic ratios of these various metals. Our scientists have been able to do it. So that did not prove it was extraterrestrial manufacture. We did not get the chain of custody. We don't know who had picked it up, and we don't know how it got into the hands of the people who had done the investigation. And now nobody talks about that anymore because it just blew up. It did not pan out. And that's where we are with all these pieces of debris. There's always an element that wrecks it. I was just talking to some researchers down in Brazil just Thursday as a matter of fact. And we were talking about the Ubatuba sample, which was this object was seen to supposedly blow up in 1947. Pieces rained down on the beach and into the water, and this guy picked up a bunch of pieces and sent it to a reporter in Brazil. But the problem is, we don't know who the guy was. The chain of custody is broken. We don't know how it got from the beach to the reporter. And then when they looked at the sample, they said, well, this was magnesium of a purity that was unobtainable on Earth at the time, 1957. But the point is, Dow Chemical had made magnesium of equal purity at the time. And then just recently, Jacques Vallée threw a new monkey wrench into this whole tale by saying everybody talks about how it happened in September of 1957, but it didn't. It happened back in the 1930s. Well, that wrecks the story even more. So you wonder, how did the guy in 1957 get his hands on this metal that was supposedly found in the 1930s? And then it ended up in the hands of the Lorenzens, who subjected it to some analysis and came up with some interesting things. They sent a piece of the material to the Air Force, which this always cracks me up, sent a piece to the Air Force, and the Air Force inadvertently destroyed it in the process of trying to get a spectroscopic analysis of it.
Unbelievable.
Well, but the Air Force comes back and says, could you send us another sample? And the Lorenzen said no. I got a sample of an alien spacecraft, and you destroyed yours, and you want me to give you more of it? I don't think so.
Unbelievable.
But then the sample disappeared. It was found later, and Peter Sturrock did some analysis of it and says, well, it's very interesting, but it still doesn't prove an extraterrestrial manufacture. So, that's where we are when we're looking at debris. Every piece of debris that has been submitted cannot be proven to have come from an alien spacecraft. My biggest fear was, you've got a real piece of an alien spacecraft. I mean, it's real. You have it. You have it analyzed. They said, yeah, it's aluminum. What do? It doesn't prove it's aluminum. You can't prove it's extraterrestrial, even though it may well be extraterrestrial. You can't prove it because you can find it here on Earth.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so let's talk about give us an idea of all the books that we just kind of talked at, because I know before we had only talked about 3, but give us an idea of, I know I did when I went on Amazon. I think I found 36 of your books. And so which books today were we discussing?
We were talking about operation. We were talking about Understanding Roswell. That just came out a few weeks ago.
Right.
And the whole case looked at the Roswell case. We talked about Levelland, which was cleverly called Levelland.
Okay.
and of course, available. It came out a few months ago, and it's available on Amazon. We didn't talk about it, but I did a book called The Best of Project Blue Book, and I mentioned that because
that's right. We didn't talk about that.
But it's got analysis of some of the cases and shows how the Air Force kind of manipulated the data and went awry, and some of the best cases that are available through the Project Blue Book files with the documentation of them. I mentioned Roswell in the 21st Century, which is a book I did a few years ago, which was looking at the case from our perspective in 2016, of the work that Don Schmidt and Tom Carey and Stan Friedman and Don Berliner and I had done over the years on the Roswell case. I mentioned the UFO crash at Roswell because that's where the Crum-Schroeder information shows up about the sample that Pappy Henderson did. But the latest books are Understanding Roswell, Levelland, the Best of Project Blue Book,
the deep state.
UFOs in the Deep State.
That's right. That's right.
But I also did another book called Encounter in the Desert, which is about the Lonnie Zamora sighting, and that came out not all that long ago as well. It's kind of an in-depth analysis. And I'll say real quickly here, one of the things about that case is I always was a little dismissive of the case because it was single witness. It was just Lonnie Zamora. Yeah, credible source, landing traces and all that stuff, but it was single source. I was talking to some guys, Ben Moss and Tony Angiola, who mentioned to me that 3 people had called the police station on April 24th, which is tomorrow, anniversary is tomorrow, 1964, about the flying saucer, about this event in the skies. And I said, but did you check the police logs? Did you check the police logs? And they never gave me an answer on that. And so going back through the Project Blue Book file, I found a report by a Captain Richard Holder, who was there that night, interviewed Zamora. And in that report, it says 3 people contacted the police. Nobody tried to find those people back in 1964. It's clear they were there. You could have found them. It wouldn't have been that difficult, but nobody bothered to write down the names. But that shows that the Zamora case is not single witness, and it's much more important than at least I had thought it had been. So it's called Encounter in the Desert. So those are the latest books.
Right, okay. Well, we've talked about so much today. I mean, it's just like mind-boggling. I just have one last question. What made you get into doing what you're doing and doing over 100 books?
Well, we want to make sure that people understand it's not 100 books about flying saucers.
Right.
I've done action adventure books. I've done science fiction books. My goal in life was to become a science fiction writer. But back when I was a little kid, and I hate to say this because it always dates me, my mom took me to see a movie called Earth versus the Flying Saucers, which was released in 1956. And that kind of sparked my interest. And from that point, I've always had an interest in UFOs. And I was always the kind of person who somebody told me something, I wanted to check it out. In the 1960s, the idea was, well, flying saucers, they're just indistinct things seen in the distance, a blob of light at night or something fuzzy in the distance. And a friend of mine's mother had seen a UFO, and I wanted to talk to her about it. My only real question to her was it distinct? And she said, oh, it's very sharp. She got a good look at it. It was hovering just above the barn on their ranch in South Dakota, or their farm in South Dakota. I don't know if it was a ranch or a farm. But it was very distinct. She got a good look, very sharp, clear edges. So that kind of underscored my interest. But it's always been there from the time I was a little kid. I had done writing about UFOs to magazines in the 1970s. There were a bunch of magazines that dealt with UFOs, and I was writing articles for them. And I always say that I went to college on my Saga scholarship. Saga did a magazine called UFO Report, and I would do an article for them each semester, and it just about covered my tuition at the University of Iowa. Wow. So and then it just kind of it's expanded. My interest has always been there.
Wow, that's absolutely fantastic. Well, I mean, we got a plethora of information today, obviously, and so I mean, that's a lot to take in. But I want to just say I really, really appreciate you coming on and not just going through one book, but let's talk about a multiple of things here, and that's what I wanted to do. So you're not on Facebook or anything else, you just have your blog, and you have all your books on Amazon, because I've looked.
All the books are on Amazon. I do a 3-minute segment on Coast to Coast AM, either on Thursday or Friday nights. I think the next one is going to be on Friday night. It's usually around 20 minutes after the beginning of the show. George Norrie comes on and does his thing, and then he has one guest on, and I come on.
Oh, fantastic.
And then I do a radio show, podcast, and now it's a TV show on the X Zone Broadcast Network. So you go to xzbn.net and you can find all the information about that. On my blog, there's actually a player so you can listen to all my interviews. I got nearly 200 hours of interviews with people in the UFO field that you can listen to. I talked to, for example, Jacques Vallée, and she listened to my interview with Jacques Vallée about that. I talked to Avi Loeb, who was the Harvard scientist that talked about the object flying through our solar system. So I've talked to some of the big names and some of the people you probably haven't heard of. They have interesting stories.
Okay, well, you're one of the big names, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, because, I mean, I've read your bio, and it's, you know, like you said before, you don't want to get into this. I mean, you don't want to get into your bio, and when you told me, you were like, no, I mean, it's just absolutely incredible, and you're absolutely incredible. And I just want to tell you thank you so much again for coming on today and doing something different that I told you about. Instead of the Two-Face, I call it the Muppet movie. But I just want to say thank you so much again. And I really appreciate it, and thank you for serving our country.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the effort to expand on all my books.
Okay, yes, on all of them instead of just one. That's what I wanted to do. Okay, I think we got it all, and I'm really excited to put this out there, and thank you again.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.